Hello everybody, my name's Andy and I hope this is going through live at the moment. Decided to do this as a live stream because I can and I've got a topic in mind today, which is learning difficult languages or learning a language that is very different to your own language or to a language that you've learned before. How do we go about this? And do we go about this in a different way to learning a language that's more classed as easier to learn? So, first of all, let's just start by saying what makes a language difficult. So, as a native English speaker, I often see posts on Facebook, and I've read blogs about this, are saying what the most difficult language is, trying to rank languages in order. So, you start off with languages at the bottom of the ladder which are easier. So, for example, for an English native speaker, Dutch and German will be easy languages because they have lots of cognates. The grammar might be similar. And so, for example, words such as, I don't know, like to find in English, finden in German, leder, which is leather. There are so many different words that are similar or the same. And when you start reading the text, you can get an idea of what a word might mean, even if you don't know it before. If you haven't come across it, you can have a good educated guess. And then next up the ladder, you have languages such as French and Spanish, the Romance languages, which are classed as maybe a little bit more different because the grammar is slightly different. And then you have more and more languages which are different. So then you get up to languages such as Russian, which has a completely different script, and it's a Slavic language, so it's not like English at all, but it's still in the group of languages, the Indo-European family of languages. So there are still lots of cognates, but you have to deal with a different writing script and read the Cyrillic script. And then when you get up to the top of the list, you have languages such as Chinese, Mandarin, Hungarian. So Chinese will be there for obvious reasons, such as the writing system is so completely different. You have characters instead of an alphabet, and it's a tonal language, so you have to learn how to speak tonally. And the cognates, well, there aren't really that many between English and Mandarin. So you can see why that would be classed as one of the most difficult languages to learn. So why is Hungarian up there, for example? That's a language that's written in the same script as English, but it's not from the same family of languages, obviously. So it's from the Finno-Ugric group of languages. And the grammar is just so very different from English. So at the moment, I've started learning Hungarian again. I've tried to learn Hungarian in the past a couple of times, and I haven't had as much success as I have with other languages. But then, in fairness, I haven't really focused as much on Hungarian. You know, I've never sort of sat down and tried to learn Hungarian while I was not learning any other languages. But now I'm just focusing on Hungarian because I'm going to go to the Polyglot Conference, which is in Budapest this year. And that's in October. So that gives me about 5 months to start brushing up and relearning my Hungarian. So tips on how to start a language that's very different from your own language or very different to a language that you've learned before. Tip number one is going to be just go for it, because you'll be put off by these kind of blogs I just mentioned about saying which languages are the most difficult. And it will kind of make you feel that, perhaps I should start learning an easier language first. Perhaps I should get my head around German first before I move on to Spanish, before I move on to Russian, before I can move on to, say, Filipino or something, Tagalog. So if you start thinking like that, then you're never going to be able to start learning this difficult language. So why do you want to learn this language in the first place anyway? Is it because you have relatives, or you're going to be working there, or you want to study, or you just think it's going to be cool? For whatever your reasons are, hopefully you'll have some kind of motivation to learn this language, and you just need to start learning. So just go for it. Just start it. When you first start learning a language, what I do is probably the same as everybody else, start learning phrases that are useful. So the beginner's phrases such as, hi, my name's Andy, I'm 62 years old, I live in Portsmouth, I have a cat. Yes, I have a cat. She's on my lap at the moment. There she is, cleaning herself. She's quite heavy, actually. And so you start learning those phrases that you learn from the beginning to start getting you into the language. Some people will want to learn the alphabet first, and that's another way to start learning a language. But when you're learning a very different language, say, for example, Arabic, and you're starting to learn the alphabet, it's going to take longer for you to be able to produce anything because you're having to learn this new system before you can even start having a chat. So I do recommend from day one trying to learn those phrases. Even if your pronunciation is bad at the beginning, it will improve in time if you keep having exposure to the language and keep practicing. So that's stage one, as far as I'm concerned, is just go for it. Just have a go. I've got some notes here as well because I don't want to wander off on a tangent. So when you just go for it, you might have to have different resources than ones you've had if you've done any previous language learning. So if you're learning a language that's difficult and doesn't have many resources, so for example, when I started learning Kurdish, I couldn't find many materials to learn it, so I had to resort to books. I did find a few websites and obviously trying to practice with people who were Kurdish in my environment, but I didn't always have a great opportunity to do that every day. So I kind of went out to try to find Kurdish people to speak to, and I worked in a shop where there were a few Kurdish customers, but that was a different approach because you couldn't do Duolingo, you couldn't do those kind of apps that were available in the bigger languages. So you might want to experiment with the resources that you have. If you've tried to learn this language in the past and you haven't really gotten very far, and you feel like your confidence is quite low and you think, oh, well, I was a bit of a failure in that language. I didn't really do very well in Hungarian because I just couldn't get my head around, even the basics, like saying, oh, I want to go shopping or something. You need to maybe find a different resource, a different way of learning the language. So you might want to try changing. You might have had I don't know, you might be using the wrong resource. So do a bit of experimentation and start again. And I think that exposing yourself to a language is a very good way to get into the language. So even though you don't know any language yet, and you're just starting out with that difficult language, you could start watching films in the language to get you into watching and listening to the language. So even though you won't know any of the language, obviously you need to learn some of it. While you're learning it, you can be watching these films and listening to podcasts and get a feel for the intonation of the language. And then obviously later you will benefit more from these because you will start engaging with them more when you start learning the language a bit more. Make it fun. So make your language learning a fun activity. It doesn't have to be serious. It doesn't have to be boring. If you're struggling with those new alphabet characters, you're struggling with the sound. So you might be listening to Mandarin and think, well, I can't tell the difference between the different tones, which is an up tone or a down tone. And if you start watching things like children's cartoons, you could have a bit of fun trying to replicate some of the nursery songs or the phrases within those. So that's what I did at first. I subscribed to a Mandarin YouTube channel, and it had little children's songs on it and cartoons, and there were songs such as saying like how old somebody was. So it was, one person was saying I'm 40 years old, another one was saying I'm 10 years old, another one was saying I'm 50 years old, and so on. And they had little cartoons to go with the people. And then another one was about families. So it was like, this is my family. And I still remember the little songs like Joshua the Tiaren, which means this is my family. And even though I couldn't replicate the tones in those days, I was getting an idea of the sentences, and then later I was able to sort of perfect, or not perfect, but improve on my accent and my pronunciation. So here's my cat, Joshua the Mao. She's, how old is she? I don't know. She's 8岁. That means she's 8 years old in Mandarin. So by immersing yourself in the language, you can do those things such as you can listen to podcasts, you can watch YouTube videos, you can have a TV program, you can switch on to radio, listen to music in the background. You can also do things like put post-it notes of the items or nouns and put them around your house. So you can put the word for mirror on the mirror, word for fridge on the fridge, word for cat on the cat if she doesn't mind. And that way you get more exposure to the language and gradually you'll pick it up. Don't be put off by the fact that you're trying to learn a difficult language. It might take a little bit more time to get into the language. What I find is that the attitude towards difficult languages is different. So people will say, oh, you can't learn Chinese, it's so difficult. But there are some easier aspects of Chinese that are amazing. So for example, there are no verb conjugations in Chinese. So when you start learning the verbs, you don't need to conjugate them. So for example, you will say, I go, he go, she go. And in the past, you'd say, I yesterday go, or I last year go. So it's quite simple once you get into that different mindset and different way of thinking. What else to say about difficult languages? Learning a difficult language is probably more rewarding, and it's really worth it. It's worth the time and effort to put in to learn the language, because when you get to a certain stage in that language and you get to a certain stage where you feel comfortable with kind of being able to guess what something means because you start knowing about the grammar, or you start knowing about the rules of how the language works, then you start to begin to feel rewarded. That happens in every language anyway, and you can start feeling more inspired to go on to learn some more, because you get to that stage where you might start striking up conversations with people, or being able to understand those podcasts that you're listening to, being able to understand 50%, 60%, which is really rewarding. One of my tips for learning languages generally is repetition. So I know I keep repeating myself about this, but it's really important to have repetition in your language learning. So I might do a lesson, for example, with Pimsleur, and Pimsleur in itself is repetitive. It works on spaced repetition. And then a year later, I might try to do those lessons again in language that I've learned before. And that kind of reinforces it cements what you're trying to learn. So when you repeat listening or watching films, listen to a podcast, you might get more information from it the second time round, the third time round, the fourth time round. And even though you might think you're not learning anything extra, you're connecting up something in your brain. I don't know how it works, but somewhere along the line, some neurons or synapses will be going yippee and remembering it in a long-term memory. So I think Steve Kaufman talks about this in his videos. I often watch I haven't watched his